In today's video, we'll be delving into the despair iceberg, which is mostly a collection of dark and eerie philosophical and psychological theories and concepts. It's a little different to most of my other videos. It's not about murder or disappearances, it's not gory or violent, but it's deeply unsettling in a totally different way, and I'm confident you'll finish this video in a much more disturbed state of mind than you started. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video contains various theories and concepts that may leave you with a deep sense of dread and pessimism, so proceed with caution if you are currently suffering with depression. You can click the link in the description to become a Ko-fi member and watch an uncut and ad-free version of this video, which features a couple of extra entries that were too disturbing for this cut. This iceberg contains over 100 entries, but some were very similar to others, and I wasn't able to find much information on a few of the later ones, so to avoid repetition and pointless entries with no useful information, I've merged some of them together and covered about 70 in total. I actually started this script nearly 2 years ago now. I got sidetracked, forgot about it, and only recently got around to finishing it. So if you remember me mentioning it a long time ago, here it finally is. Credit to Reddit users Sustained Disgust for creating this iceberg. "Life's figs rot at your feet" is a quote from American poet and writer Sylvia Plath's only novel. "I saw my life branching out before me like the green fig tree in the story. From the tip of every branch, like a fat purple fig, a wonderful future beckoned and winked. One fig was a husband and a happy home and children, and another fig was a famous poet, and another fig was a brilliant professor, and another fig was E.G., the amazing editor, and another fig was Europe and Africa and South America, and another fig was Constantine and Socrates and Attila, and a pack of other lovers with queer names and offbeat professions, and another fig was an Olympic lady crew champion, and beyond and above these figs were many more figs I couldn't quite make out. I saw myself sitting in the crotch of this fig tree, starving to death, just because I couldn't make up my mind which of the figs I would choose. I wanted each and every one of them, but choosing one meant losing all the rest. And as I sat there, unable to decide, the figs began to wrinkle and go black, and one by one, they plopped to the ground at my feet. The moral of the story is that more is lost through indecision than the wrong decision, and if you waste time overthinking your options, before you know it, you might have no options left. The death drive was originally proposed by Sabina Spielrein and later elaborated on by Sigmund Freud, who also called it the destructive instinct. It's pretty much what it sounds like, the drive towards death, destruction, and forgetfulness. It's the opposite of eros, which, simplistically, in this context, is the will to live, or just the will, as described by Arthur Schopenhauer. The death drive causes people to act in a way that is counterintuitive, manifesting as aggressive and self-destructive behavior. H.P. Lovecraft was an American writer who had his own distinctive style of sci-fi, horror, and fantasy writing. According to Wikipedia, Cosmicism states that there is no recognizable divine presence, such as a god, in the universe, and that humans are particularly insignificant in the larger scheme of intergalactic existence. The most prominent theme is humanity's fear of their insignificance in the face of an incomprehensibly large universe, a fear of the cosmic void. Lovecraft was best known for his Cthulhu mythos, which centered around a godlike entity that was terrifyingly powerful and has been described as a manifestation of chaos and destruction. The stories involving Cthulhu are the epitome of cosmicism because they highlight the protagonist's total lack of power to change anything in the vast, indifferent universe they're in. A Less Wrong community blog user named Roko shared a thought experiment in 2010 that has become known as Roko's Basilisk. He proposed the idea that if one day a highly powerful AI agent is created, that it would want to torture anyone who had previously imagined it but did nothing to bring it into existence. Kind of like the concept of the game, which you now just lost, sorry. Simply hearing this argument would be enough to put you in the AI agent's firing line, had you not already imagined it. Many users on the blog rejected the idea, arguing that such an agent would see no point in harming anyone based on their past decisions, as it would not benefit it in any way, and it'd simply be a waste of time and resources. The belief in the existence of extraterrestrial life is increasingly common. It makes sense that given the size of the universe, Earth can't be the only planet that life has occurred. But if aliens do exist, where are they? Why haven't they visited Earth? And why do we have no hard evidence of them? That's basically the Fermi paradox. I don't know which is more terrifying, the possibility that life exists outside of the planet we live on, or the possibility that we are totally alone in the universe. Doomer is a name given to people who are very pessimistic about global problems like overpopulation and climate change, and believe there's a high chance that such problems will lead to human extinction. Moral nihilism is the belief that nothing is inherently moral or immoral. In other words, there are no moral facts, so while it's a widely held belief that murder, for example, is morally wrong, it cannot be objectively immoral or moral, as morality doesn't actually exist in reality, it's a man-made concept. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection focused on the survival of the fittest organism, whereas proponents of the selfish gene theory, notably Richard Dawkins, emphasize the survival of the fittest gene. Simplistically, selfish gene theory implies that each individual organism is insignificant, and it's the genes that comprise us that are important, because organisms exist only temporarily, whereas genes are potentially immortal. The Brain in a Vat is a thought experiment that outlines the scenario of a mad scientist, or evil demon, as proposed by René Descartes, removing the brain from a person's body and placing it in a jar with wires connecting the neurons to a computer that would provide electrical impulses to stimulate reality. Theoretically, the brain would realize no difference in consciousness and would experience reality the same as you or me, even though it is disembodied and not actually interacting with anything in the real world. Better Never to Have Been is a book written by David Benatar in 2006 that centers around anti-natalism, the view that procreation is morally wrong. Anti-natalists believe that overall, pain and suffering outweighs happiness in human life, and therefore having children is unjustifiable, particularly considering no one asks to be born, so having children is a selfish decision. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer described the will as the force possessed by all living beings to pursue and propagate life. It's the drive responsible for life, but it's also responsible for mankind's suffering. In his central work, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer follows on from the ideas of Immanuel Kant and proposes that we do not experience objective reality. The way we perceive the world might not actually be how it is, because we are not passive observers, and every piece of information that compiles to form perception is not experienced directly, but rather after it has passed through the filter that is the brain, which may distort it in some way. Sisyphus was a figure of Greek mythology who was given the punishment of pushing a boulder up a mountain, and each time he reached the top, it would roll back down and he'd have to start again. Parallels can be drawn between the story and to life, as it can be argued that we often go around in circles and never really get anywhere. In his 1942 essay, Albert Camus introduced his absurdism theory, which states that life and the world in general lacks meaning or a higher purpose, and the juxtaposition between this and the need we all feel to attribute meaning is the absurdity. Camus concludes the essay with this line: "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Overpopulation is a term that we're all familiar with in 2024, and it's a worrying possibility. It's not a new thought though, as way back in 1798, Thomas Robert Malthus pondered on the assertion that human growth is exponential, while the growth of food and other resources is linear, inevitably leading to a deterioration in living conditions. Pessimism is a common feature throughout the work of various philosophers, such as the aforementioned Arthur Schopenhauer. Friedrich Nietzsche had a slightly different view on it, however, and believed that pessimism should be used as a tool to re-evaluate old values and create new ones. Change should be accepted, and suffering should be embraced, as it is necessary. In one of his books, he wrote, "My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, love of fate. That one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less conceal it. All idealism is mendacity in the face of what is necessary, but love it." Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, killed 3 people and injured a further 23 with bombs in his quest to halt technological advancement. In his manifesto, he asserted that while the Industrial Revolution has been beneficial in many ways, for example, it increased life expectancy for those living in advanced countries, the negatives, such as damage to the environment and psychological suffering, far outweigh the positives. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment was a 1971 simulation of a prison environment where participants were split into 2 groups, the prison guards and the prisoners. To cement the roles the participants would be playing, various measures were put in place. For example, prisoners were arrested outside, given numbers rather than names, strip-searched and dressed in smocks, and guards were given uniforms and sunglasses to wear and instructed to prevent prisoners from leaving. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but had to be ended after 6 days due to the guards getting a little too into character and humiliating and abusing the prisoners. For example, by spraying them with fire extinguishers, forcing them to do push-ups as punishment, keeping them in solitary confinement, withholding food, restricting bathroom access, and making them use a bucket in their cells instead. The study has been highly criticised, not only ethically, but in terms of reliability and application of results. As well, it has been used to explain behaviour in incidents such as Abu Ghraib, where American soldiers tortured and abused detainees in the Iraqi prison. Other researchers have been unable to replicate the results. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment where participants were told to administer electric shocks of increasing voltage to a learner who was in another room each time they got an answer to a question wrong. The later shocks were strong enough to have killed the learner had they been real. Many participants administered these potentially fatal shocks, albeit reluctantly, despite hearing the learner scream. The motivation behind this study stemmed from the question of whether Nazi war criminals were just following orders in the Holocaust. The study has been replicated numerous times with similar results. The Denial of Death is a book written by Ernest Becker, published in 1973, which centers around the internal conflict that occurs in humans due to the natural self-preservation instinct we possess, paired with the knowledge that we are mortal, that death is unavoidable and unpredictable. Becker talks of a symbolic human meaning separate to the physical world of objects and biology, which eases the suffering caused by this knowledge of mortality, because by creating a legacy, we feel that a part of us will live on after we die, an immortality project, as he calls it. Nausea, published in 1938, was Jean-Paul Sartre's first novel, which focused on a writer named Antoine who seems to be suffering with depression, with nausea being one of his main symptoms. Written in diary form, it's an exploration of existentialism, with Antoine documenting his rather pessimistic thoughts and feelings about the world, which he believes intrudes on his freedom as a human being. I haven't read the book, but it sounds quite depressing to say the least. Here's a line from it. Every existing thing is born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. The word solipsism is defined as the quality of being very self-centered or selfish. In philosophy, it's the theory that you can only be sure that your own mind exists and nothing else can be proven. This was actually one of the first philosophical concepts that really fascinated me, and I could probably make a whole video on it because it's kinda terrifying. Going one step further than the thoughts of Arthur Schopenhauer and Immanuel Kant, who suggested that we do not perceive reality as it actually is, this theory would suggest that there is nothing to perceive outside of your own mind. There is no physical world, no other people or minds. Your physical body may not even be real. One of the first philosophers to have popularized this idea was René Descartes, who famously said, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, therefore I am. He believed that we should not assume anything exists or that it's true unless we can prove it. Not only information that we're told, as that could be false, but everything we see, hear, smell, and taste, because human perception is also unreliable. Descartes stated that the only thing you cannot doubt is your own existence, because the fact that you are thinking proves it. Anarcho-Pessimism is the collective writings of Lawrence Labadie, an American author and individualist anarchist. I wasn't able to find a good summary of the book, but here's a quote from it. "Collectivism is a crowd mind doctrine. To those who have ever been the losers in the unequal, privileged, and despotic struggle for existence, who have not felt the glory and the satisfaction of conquering obstacles and the achievement of aims, the thought of peace and security is soothing and endearing. Nevertheless, life is essentially a struggle, and peace, in a sense, stagnation and death. We say of the dead that they are at peace." Published in 2010, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race is a non-fiction book written by Thomas Ligotti that comprises a series of essays exploring philosophical pessimism and anti-natalism, which we covered earlier. Ligotti believed that the suffering endured in life outweighs any pleasure we experience, and that the more aware a person is of that assertion, and the meaningless of life, the more they feel compelled to distract themselves and convince themselves otherwise. Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." What he meant by this is that in the natural world, without a civilized society, people would live free and unrestricted lives, whereas the laws and social constructs that exist within society prevent us from doing whatever we want. This is both a blessing and a curse, as we sacrifice freedom for safety and security. "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," was purportedly the deathbed quote of Hassan I-Sabbah, founder of the Order of Assassins, a notorious cult in ancient Iran that murdered their enemies in public, though didn't harm civilians. In recent times, it became popular due to it featuring in an Assassin's Creed game. It basically means that everyone's perception of what is true is different because everyone experiences life differently. For example, Christians believe in God and think the guidelines of their religion dictates how one should live their life, whereas atheists do not believe there is a God and their values and opinions have derived from non-religious sources. Dukkha is the first of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. It translates to suffering, unhappiness, pain, or stress, and refers to the unsatisfactory feeling that arises from the mundaneness of everyday life. In 1898, the Zibaldone, a series of notes written by Giacomo Leopardi, consisting of various philosophical observations, was published in 7 volumes. Leopardi believed that the modern man is corrupted by the rejection of illusions of myth and religion, which he thought were necessary for happiness. Instead, man is consumed by a depressing reality consisting of annihilation and emptiness. Contrary to the common belief that when a person is depressed, they view themselves and the world negatively, sometimes to a point of delusion, depressive realism suggests that depressed individuals actually make more realistic inferences than non-depressed individuals. The results of various studies have been used to support this hypothesis, including studies where participants were asked to perform a task, then rate their overall performance, and it was found that depressed individuals rated themselves more accurately than non-depressed individuals who demonstrated positive bias. However, studies also showed that depressed individuals were more likely to rate others with a positive bias than non-depressed individuals. Miguel de Unamuno was a Spanish philosopher who wrote a book titled Tragic Sense of Life, which explores the conflict between faith and reason. In it, he argues that without a sense of eternal life, which one may gain through theism, the purposes of individuals become futile and meaningless because none of it will matter once a person is dead and gone. The Despair Code is a theory that originated on 4chan's paranormal board and seemingly has no evidence or even reason to back it up, so I'll just provide a brief summary. It ties in with various other conspiracies like the Illuminati, MKUltra, and the belief that Lovecraftian creatures actually exist. The code itself is 7 numbers, 32234112, and supposedly, if exposed to it, one will become depressed, lose their mind, and eventually take their own life. It's been 2 years since I wrote this entry and was first exposed to this code, and I can confirm that I am not depressed. I think my mind is still intact, and I'm very much alive. So it's safe to say this is a hoax. Emil Cioran was a Romanian philosopher who wrote various books that could be described as ramblings. He often contradicted himself from one chapter to the next and left readers baffled as to what points he was trying to make. One theme that was quite consistent throughout his life was failure. He considered events in his life that most would class as successes to be failures, though seemed to be somewhat comfortable with that, as failure is a companion that stays with us all until we die, so we may as well befriend it. In fact, if we reframe failure, we might realize that it can benefit us more than our successes, as it gives us a true picture of who we really are, whereas success feeds into the delusional and inaccurate illusion of who we think we are. Nihilistic Communism is the title of a book consisting of essays that aims to level a critique of optimism in the far left by covering various anti-authoritarian, anti-political, anti-organizational, communist perspectives. Cosmic Pessimism is a book written by Eugene Thacker that's only 55 pages long, so I decided to read it. It's basically an analysis of pessimistic philosophy. We've covered a few relevant concepts already, the main premise being our existence is pointless and depressing, nothing we do really matters in the grand scheme of things, and suffering is prevalent throughout life. Thacker critiques the works of a few different philosophers, but mainly focuses on Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. For example, he notes that Schopenhauer, using the metaphors of astronomy, stated that there were three types of writers: meteors, planets, and fixed stars. Thacker then questions if Schopenhauer was aware that he was the fourth type of writer, the black hole. Nietzsche once spoke of the value of incomplete thoughts, which his notebooks were full of, and said it, quote, displays the most beautiful butterfly wings, and it slips away from us. Thacker mocked this and said he was rarely able to distinguish the incomplete thought from the merely lazy thought. Mark Fisher was a philosopher and writer who wrote of the slow cancellation of the future, referring to the collapse of hope that the world might be improved. He attributed the lack of cultural progress in the UK to a number of factors, including the destruction of artistic infrastructure, which has, quote, deprived artists of the resources necessary to produce the new. He also criticised capitalism, highlighting its effect on education, mental illness, etc., using the term capitalist realism to describe, quote, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. His bleak view of the future likely contributed to his decision to take his own life in 2017 at the age of 48. In The Silence of Animals, John Gray focuses on the notion that while society has seemingly evolved, becoming less barbaric in many ways, humans themselves have not. Deep down, we are still as violent and nasty as we always have been, and these qualities lie just beneath the sense of self that we have created to convince ourselves that we are morally good people, when in actuality, we will ditch our values and do whatever it takes to survive. As the title of this book suggests, Religion and Nothingness is a deep dive into the relationship between religion and nihilism, suggesting that one can only be ready for religion when they have reached a state of nihilism that has stripped away their ego, and nihility can only be overcome by becoming radicalized to nothingness. Hannah Arendt was a Jewish writer who fled Germany during Hitler's rise to power. She wrote a book on Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the Holocaust, in an attempt to explain his actions. She believed that despite his actions, he didn't personally hate Jewish people. She highlighted that contrary to his claims, Eichmann wasn't very intelligent, lacked the ability to think for himself, and she believed his ego was more important to him than his defense for the crimes he committed, suggesting he may have preferred to be executed as a war criminal than live as a nobody. The concept of banality of evil was applied to Eichmann as perhaps he wasn't a sociopath, but rather an extremely average and mundane person who was motivated by professional promotion and success rather than ideology. Every Cradle is a Grave is a book written by Sarah Perry that centers around the ethics of human existence. It covers anti-natalism, the view that procreation is morally wrong, and also considers whether humans, who exist through no choice of their own, should be forced to live out their natural lifespan. Solar plexus clown gliders refers to a group of cryptids that were first proposed in a chain email that went around in the late 90s, which claimed that reading or even hearing the words solar plexus clown glider put you at risk of infection from a paranormal entity that infects weak and vulnerable people through the solar plexus. As with the despair code, I heard about this nearly 2 years ago now and still haven't been infected by a paranormal entity, so I'm sure you'll be fine too. The Last Messiah is an essay written by Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapffe in 1933. Inspired by Nietzsche, though disagreeing with him in some areas, Zapffe believed that existential crisis is the result of an overly evolved intellect, and that people can overcome this by artificially limiting the content of consciousness. Methods for limiting it could include isolation, avoiding thinking as it is just confusing in his words, anchoring and distraction. Julio Cabrera's negative ethics theory centers around anti-natalism and goes as far as to suggest that procreation is a supreme act of manipulation, as children are not created for their own sake, but rather for the parents' sake, and are usually considered as aesthetic objects. He argued that a person who abides by negative ethics should not only refrain from procreation, but should be open to an ethical death, to abandon personal projects in benefit of a political fight, and failing that, they should consider altruistic suicide. The Accursed Share is a 1949 book about political economy that centers around the author, George Bataille's theory of consumption. Wikipedia defines the accursed share as that excessive and non-recuperable part of any economy which must either be spent luxuriously and knowingly without gain in the arts, in non-procreative society, in spectacles and sumptuous monuments, or it is obliviously destined to an outrageous and catastrophic outpouring, in the contemporary age most often in war, or in former ages as destruction and ruinous acts of giving or sacrifice, but always in a manner that threatens the prevailing system. Rejectionism is basically an anti-existence line of thinking that heavily ties in with anti-natalism, and its core focus is compassion and the avoidance of suffering. Some philosophers who advocate for rejectionism, like Ken Coates, in addition to acknowledging the suffering of humans themselves, who didn't ask to be born, highlight that humans cause unnecessary suffering to animals too, for example by enslaving and killing them for food and subjecting them to other cruelties. Nick Land has been described as the father of Accelerationism, a theory that proposes that capitalist growth and technological advancement should be drastically intensified to accelerate social change. He stated that nothing human survives the near future, implying that accelerationism should be prioritized over the lives and well-beings of humans that exist right now. His theories incorporate racist views, and he has explored themes of eugenics, leading many to recognize him as an inspiration for the alt-right and white supremacist ideology. Paul Virilio used the term pure war to describe the invisible war that technology is waging against humanity. Every new invention may solve many problems, but also creates new problems. For example, the invention of cars resulted in the possibility of car crashes, and the invention of nuclear energy has caused various catastrophic nuclear disasters, like Hiroshima and Chernobyl. Man After Man is a book written by Dougal Dixon and published in 1990 that begins 200 years in the future, when humans have almost destroyed the planet. It explores the possibilities of the future, how we will evolve, how we will adapt to changes we might face, how we will impact other living things, how we will cope with the possible threats like a new ice age and the consequences of climate change, and whether or not the human race will exist indefinitely. Theodore Adorno believed that a good, honest life is no longer possible because we live in an inhuman society. He was primarily concerned with human suffering, specifically modern society's effect on the human condition, and highlighted various topics that prevented a good life, from the decay of conversation to the desolation of the family. In 1910, at the age of 23, Carlo Mitchelstaetter completed his doctoral thesis titled Persuasion and Rhetoric. He believed that the life most people live is an absence of life in which people are deceived by empty pleasures. A main part of rhetoric, which is the conventions of the individual, the weak, and society, is social life, in which people overpower themselves and nature for their own pleasure. One can achieve persuasion by living in the present, treating every moment like their last, and therefore freeing themselves from the fear of death. As soon as Carlo completed this thesis, he took his own life. Eco-fascism is the idea that the government should seriously restrict the rights of the people to prevent harm to the environment. Pentti Linkola called it lifeboat ethics and believed that democracy was a mistake because of all the negative consequences it has resulted in, particularly regarding the environment. He believed there needed to be a dramatic reduction in the world population and once said, quote, "If there were a button I could press, I would sacrifice myself without even hesitating, if it meant millions of people would die." He even supported acts of terrorism, viewing them as disruptions to a society that is responsible for the destruction of the earth. He was once asked why he had not become a terrorist himself and said it was because he lacked the ability and bravery. Jeremy Bentham was an English philosopher who believes that power should be visible and unverifiable. He introduced the concept of the panopticon, describing a tower placed within a circle of prison cells, where the guard in the tower could see all the inmates, but the inmates can't see into the tower, so they'd never know if they were being watched at any given time, but they'd have to act like they were always being watched. If it was possible to do this with the whole population, Jeremy believed that everyone would behave in a more moral and productive way. René Girard's mimetic theory recognizes that human desire is not autonomous, rather we subconsciously desire something because others desire it. Mimetic rivalry occurs when two or more people desire an object that cannot be shared, such as a job, which results in conflict. Each person will claim their desire is original and is more prone to blaming others than recognizing their own complicity in mimetic rivalries. The scapegoat mechanism is introduced when rivals find someone to blame for the conflict that they can unite against, whether that person is guilty or not. Jean Baudrillard came up with the concept of hyperreality, linked to simulacrum, which is something that replaces reality with its representations. He believed the modern world is a simulacrum, where reality has been replaced by false images, and now people cannot distinguish between what is real and what isn't. Everything we know comes from the news on TV, the internet, and other technological sources that didn't exist in the past. How can we know what's real anymore? He described 4 basic historical phases. The first is the true, basic reality which is faithfully represented. In phase 2, reality still exists, but the representation is distorted slightly, perhaps romanticized. In phase 3, reality no longer exists, but you wouldn't realize because the representation feigns a reality. In phase 4, there is no reality to represent, there is only simulation, which is far more appealing than reality ever was. Jean believed that Western society is in this 4th phase. In the 1960s, William Burroughs developed his thesis that language is a virus. He believed that human is not an identity, but a relationship between the body and word virus, or language. The human is rarely in control, and language maintains a level of control over the human. In his novel, The Ticket That Exploded, he wrote, "The word may once have been a healthy neural cell. It is now a parasitic organism that invades and damages the central nervous system. Man has lost the option of silence. Try halting your subvocal speech. Try to achieve even 10 seconds of inner silence. You will encounter a resisting organism that forces you to talk. That organism is the word. Entropy pessimism is a pseudoscientific theory that human use of energy will automatically degrade our ecosystem because the energy in the ecosystem is limited. The Zurau aphorisms are a set of more than 100 aphorisms written by Franz Kafka between 1917 and 1918. Here are a few examples, translated from German. The true way is along a rope that is not spanned high in the air, but only just above the ground. It seems intended more to cause stumbling than to be walked along. Beyond a certain point, there is no return. This point has to be reached. There are innumerable hiding places and only one salvation, but the possibilities of salvation are as numerous as the hiding places. There is a destination, but no way there. What we refer to as way is hesitation. A cage went in search of a bird. Don't let evil convince you could keep any secrets from it. How is it possible to rejoice in the world except by fleeing to it? When one has once accepted and absorbed evil, it no longer demands to be believed. The crows maintain that a single crow could destroy the heavens. There is no doubt of that, but it proves nothing against the heavens, for heaven simply means the impossibility of crows. There is no having, only a being, only a state of being that craves the last breath, craves suffocation. Libidinal economy, written by Francois Lyotard, has been described by some as word salad and schizophrenic ramblings. A 2-star review of the book on Goodreads.com summarised the main point of it, quote, Lyotard's central claim is that we both take our shit too seriously and don't take our shit seriously enough. We take it too seriously when we or deify it. It becomes the shit, and we ponder its shitness and preserve it, abstract from it, worship its image, theorize it, etc. But in doing so, we forget that it's just our shit, not the shit, and become obsessed with gaining from it. But that means we stop taking it seriously enough as the shit that it is, the effluent flow of being a critter that shits to live, or that lives to shit. Whichever direction we phrase that doesn't matter. That is, we forget to enjoy the shittiness of shit, and even forget to enjoy shitting. Buddhism has been interpreted by some philosophers as a nihilistic religion. Jean-Baptiste Duhalde stated, "They teach that a vacuum or nothing is the principle of all things, that it is from nothing that all things are produced, and to which they all return. So to live happily, we must continually strive by meditation and frequent victories over ourselves to become like this principium, and to this end accustom ourselves to do nothing, to desire nothing, to perceive nothing, and to think on nothing." In 2020, Frank B. Wilderson published a book titled Afropessimism. In very basic terms, Afropessimism is the idea that the state of slavery for black people is permanent, and that the black experience is still defined by the perpetual cycle of slavery. The book delves into the significance of race in morality and politics, and questions why anti-black violence is a predominant occurrence all around the world. Earlier, we covered the Fermi paradox, the contradiction between the lack of evidence of aliens and the various high estimates for their probability. The dark forest theory proposes an explanation for this. It compares the universe to a dark forest where every civilization is an armed hunter, stalking through the trees, trying not to make a sound. If one hunter encounters another, he must kill them to avoid being killed himself. So according to this theory, aliens are purposefully avoiding us, and if they ever did come across us, they might well try to kill us before we try to kill them. The Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, or VHEMT, is an environmental movement in favour of the extinction of humankind to prevent further environmental degradation. While against government-mandated population control, they advocate for abstaining from reproduction to gradually reduce the population until humans are extinct. The founder, Les Unite, believes that humans are incompatible with the biosphere because the vast majority of societies have not lived sustainable lifestyles, and attempts to be more environmentally friendly do not change the fact that human existence has been destructive to the earth and non-human organisms. In his 2012 book, Already Extinct, Minoru Kayo analyzes the state of the environment, including resource extraction, the realities of alternative energy, and barriers that prevent a rational or timely response to the environmental crisis. Unlike many other books on the topic, he remains brutally realistic throughout, and avoids ending the book with a happy ending, basically concluding that we don't understand the problem, we couldn't do anything about it if we did, and we wouldn't do anything about it if we could. The Medea hypothesis, coined by paleontologist Peter Ward, proposes that life on Earth is ultimately self-destructive, and that multicellular life will always eventually face mass extinction, and the Earth will return to the microbial-dominated state that it has been for most of history. Peter suggests that climate change may be the next Medean event. Gunther Anders believed that as technology advances, humans are becoming obsolete, and knowing this produces feelings of shame and embarrassment. For example, every time you write a message to a friend and a word is auto-corrected, it reminds you that you can't spell perfectly. The more reliant we become on technology, the more useless we become. In his diary, Gunther wrote, "I will provisionally call it Promethean shame for myself. I understand this to mean that shame when confronted by the humiliatingly high quality of fabricated things." Oskar Kizmeyers was a Hungarian philosopher and writer who studied the living habits of people living closer to nature in Southeast Asia. In 1971, he wrote a book titled The Beginning Was the End, which claimed that humans ultimately came to be due to cannibalism. He theorized that humans descended from apes that consumed each other's brains, resulting in brain volume increasing with each generation, but also the suppression of innate psychic ability. The book has been criticized due to its lack of evidence or references. The theory is based on Oscar's alleged conversation with cannibals, his experience of eating an ape's brain himself, and insight from meditation. Some parts of the book are outright racist, with Oscar comparing photos of Arab and African people to apes, and stating that black people have smaller brains than white people. Most Darwinists believe that evolution will only result in more complex and sophisticated organisms. However, Ray Lankester considered that the opposite might be true. Highlighting that barnacles develop from a larva similar to crabs and lobsters before attaching themselves to a permanent domicile and morphing into a simple adult form without most of its previous structure, including its brain, Ray theorized that degeneration is possible for humans too. Quote, "We are accustomed to regard ourselves as necessarily progressing, as necessarily having arrived at a higher and more elaborated condition than that which our ancestors reached, and as destined to progress still further. On the other hand, it is well to remember that we are subject to the general laws of evolution and are as likely to degenerate as to progress. Possibly, we are all drifting, tending to the condition of intellectual barnacles. The Pessimism of Jesus is an article published in the International Journal of Ethics in 1916, written by Charles Gray Shaw. It analyses the complex character that was Jesus, questioning, was Christ of classic perfection, or was he romantic and decadent? Did he make his home in the social order, or did he take up his solitary abode in the antisocial? Does he belong to optimism or to pessimism? Towards the end of the article, Charles highlighted the strong affirmative pessimism of Jesus and wrote, "The pessimistic psychology of Jesus made it possible for him to place sin in the human heart, as such without any of the optimistic makeshifts of a criminology which seeks to relegate badness to everything but man himself. In the profundity of our scientism, we conclude that crime must be due to such things as drink or diet, left-handedness or sunspots, adenoids or bad teeth. Jesus made no use of evidence alcoholic or astronomic, dietetic or dental, physiological or sociological, but with his wonted straightforwardness, declared, 'Out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness.'" A woman with the pseudonym Barbara O'Brien experienced a 6-month psychotic episode in the 1950s and shortly after wrote about her experiences in a book titled Operators and Things: The Inner Life of a Schizophrenic. Barbara was an office worker who had observed the manipulation and deception of the corporate world. She wakes up one morning to find 3 figures stood at the bottom of her bed who tell her life is in danger. These are the first operators she encounters, who control the things which she is. A few days later, she calls in sick at work and spends the next 6 months traveling around the US and Canada on a bus, following but also trying to resist the instructions of the operators. Then suddenly, the operators decide their work is done, they leave, and everything is back to normal. Barbara goes on to write an analysis of her psychotic episode and what it all meant, with surprising clarity. It has been described as one of the best insights into the mind of someone suffering with schizophrenia, and some have even said it'll have you questioning if the illness really is insanity, or if it's a perfectly sane reaction to the world we live in. Ditheism is the belief that God is not totally good, and perhaps even evil, comparable with Satan. People who hold this belief can be either theists or atheists, with the latter sometimes using the notion that God is evil as evidence that he doesn't exist, since different religions all portray God as good. Mikhail Bakunin wrote in his unfinished manuscript, God and the State, quote, "If God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him." Ditheists who believe in God argue that a deity that ignores moral corruption or shows indifference to evil while having the power to prevent it must themselves be evil. Regarding the Bible, political theorist Thomas Paine wrote, "Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the work of a demon than the work of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind, and for my part, I sincerely detest it, as I detest everything that is cruel." The Evil God Challenge is a related thought experiment that questions why an all-good God is more likely than an all-evil God. Most of the main arguments for the existence of God are not reliant on God being good, so it's arguably just as likely that God is evil. In the book of Genesis, there is a line that basically says that if you eat from the tree of knowledge, you will surely die. Similarly, there is a theory that if we continuously observe the universe, it might go into a state that will kill us all. The Big Bang Theory starts with a vacuum, and many physicists at first thought that it might have actually been a false vacuum, a bubble of space that looks like a vacuum, but isn't actually at its lowest energy state, which can collapse at any time and reach the lowest energy state. This would mean that the matter and energy of the universe was a result of this false vacuum collapsing. But the false vacuum could have just collapsed into another false vacuum, and that's the universe we live in now. Because this false vacuum is not at its lowest energy state, it could, theoretically, collapse into a true vacuum, which would destroy humanity and everything else in the universe. This collapse would not happen quicker than the speed of light, so we'd know what was happening, but be unable to do anything to stop it. Studies have shown that repeatedly observing an atom can delay it going into its lower energy state, and in turn cause it to decay quicker, so perhaps observing the universe has the same effect. The more we observe the universe in its higher energy state, the slower it moves into a lower energy state, and the more likely it is to cease to exist sooner. This theory was put forward by the physicist Lawrence Krauss, and it's terrifying enough already, but he later stated that he believes the universe is likely to already be in its high rate of decay state. This means that it's unlikely that observing the universe will destroy it quicker, but it doesn't really matter, because the end is nigh anyway. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, plus any other icebergs you might like me to cover in the future. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.